But in this second 15-minute forum of the term, we're going to think about dyslexia. Dyslexia is a specific learning difficulty. There are others. Developmental coordination disorder, or DCD, dyspraxia, or dyscalculia are others. But today we're going to think about dyslexia in particular. Strangely enough, there is no one single definition of dyslexia, but I've included one in your handout, and that's the one here, because I quite like the simplicity of it. It's fairly straightforward. It's estimated that between 4 and 10% of the population have dyslexia or dyslexic type difficulties. We know that it is a continuum, and you can be right at one end of the continuum or right at the other. The 4% would be those students and people who receive specialist teaching in order to remediate some of their difficulties. There is a high familial incidence in terms of dyslexia, and so it isn't a surprise that really it runs in families. It does affect all levels of ability and doesn't impact on intelligence. And there is, of course, no cure. Although with specialist teaching, there is a strong likelihood that some of their difficulties can be remediated. Dyslexia is recognised on the Disability Discrimination Act, but it isn't considered a medical issue. It's not a medical condition, and therefore a GP cannot help with funding for a diagnosis, unlike other disabilities, and therefore it falls really to an educational psychologist to diagnose dyslexia. They're really the only people that can. Educational psychologists, together with someone who has a postgraduate qualification in the identification of dyslexia. The usual way of identifying dyslexia is to look at what we would call a discrepancy, so we would look at their cognitive ability, and they would be performing at a much lower level in terms of their literacy. And you can even do this by looking at CATs. So the CAT scores that we would have got for some of our year groups, you can look at the non-verbal abilities, and if that's fairly high, and then their verbal ability is fairly low, probably a discrepancy of about 15 or 20 points, then there is perhaps an indicator there that there may be some dyslexic type difficulty. The problem, I think, comes when you are trying to establish a discrepancy when students have very low levels of cognition or intelligence. And when that is the case, then identification really rests on some of the key cognitive indicators of dyslexia. So those would be visual memory, which affects sight vocabulary, particularly early on in the early stages of reading, weak auditory or verbal memory, and working memory is that system where we hold information whilst we then process it. Phonic reading skills, those are the phonic decoding rules, and phonological processing ability. That's the ability to see or hear a word and then translate it into its constituent sounds. So those are key cognitive indicators that the educational psychologist would then look for. Now, for us as a school, the best that we can really do is to put students on a profile. We have a profiling system in school, and those students who are referred to us sit that profile. It's a computer-based system, but it allows us then really to talk about strengths and weaknesses in terms of those cognitive indicators. There are signs that as classroom teachers we can look out for in students, and there is a list of those there. I think it's important to say that not all dyslexic students display all of these indicators, and conversely, people who display some of these are not necessarily dyslexic. But these are some of the key ones which we'll go through. So that mismatch between general ability and literacy skills, that's the discrepancy we were talking about. It's very often the case that speaking and listening is better than reading, which of course is then better than writing. Some of our dyslexic students read actually quite well, but you have to ask whether they understand what they read. And often there is a very slow reading rate. This is evident with a couple of dyslexic students we have that attend the early morning reading intervention, and they read at such a slow rate. And so that for teachers we need to allow them extra time in order to process the information that they read. They may encounter difficulty reading new subject vocabulary, poor visual or auditory memory we've spoken about already, and then they may also exhibit some of these difficulties. Difficulties with sequencing, particularly copying notes from a board would be really quite difficult for them. But then generally organising their written work is really hard. There are some things that many dyslexic students are actually quite good at and show talents in, and these perhaps are some of the following areas. They're usually better at some of the multi-sensory approaches. So subjects where that is the case, science is often a good one. They're often very creative and artistic, make good graphic designers, good architects, that kind of thing. They're good at problem solving. They can be good at computing, and they can be good at explaining and discussing things. You will hear perhaps more and more the phrase, and I know it's difficult to read on there, but it's the gift of dyslexia, really whereby people are turning things perhaps a little bit on its head and trying to impress upon people, particularly those that are dyslexic, actually then there are some advantages or at least positive aspects that you need to think about. In particular, dyslexics often think in a different way. This one I found is really quite interesting. So instead of a learning disorder marked by impairment of ability to recognise and comprehend, then they're turning it to a learning advantage marked by the unique ability to recognise and comprehend complex visual patterns. I think you would be hard pressed to persuade some of our dyslexic learners that they have a learning advantage, and I think that is perhaps a little too much. But however, it is interesting that at this very recognisable place, JCHQ, they are employing what we would now call neurodiverse people, so people perhaps with dyslexia or another specific learning difficulty, specifically for their skills, because they are able to analyse information that comes in a variety of channels, and they're employed specifically because they can do that perhaps in a better way than non-dyslexics. So that in itself is quite interesting. I'm going to share with you 5 strategies, 4 of which we can use as teachers, particularly in the classrooms, and then one I think which is relevant to students as they come up to an examination period. Keywords are really quite important. This isn't the first time we've talked about how important keywords are, and I don't think you can belittle that in any way. It's important that we provide those as much and as often as we can. This one I know is hard for you to read, but I think providing students with some kind of structured way in which they can approach the task is important. Now, it's not to say it has always to be in terms of a writing frame. I'm not always big on writing frames, but I think there should be something that helps the student structure their work. And we have a couple of examples in your pack. To them, of course, some of this information just seems like chaotic information. And so being able to provide some kind of structure to it, it is really important for them to be able to make progress. One that I have to say I'm not very good at, and I need to get better at, is using alternative media. Okay, so audio recordings of either key speeches or messages or passages of important information, using DVD or video, and then of course that interactive whiteboard, that is something I need to improve at and get better at, but particularly some of you guys, you can use that to really great effect in a very multi-sensory way, and actually we know that's how dyslexic students work best. So if you can do that, then that's another really good strategy. And then the third one really is allow them opportunities to record what they know in different ways. So you can have posters, concept maps, which are often quite good, and I know Andrew will use those in science. You've got mind maps, and the use of information technology or computers in order to allow them to record that information differently. So those are some things that we can do as teachers in the classroom. And then as we approach what is a really important time for us, particularly with our Year 11s, but also with our sixth form, this is a strategy that really students themselves need to take on. And they need to take ownership, and they need to be involved in their revision. And they must do that in a very active way. And I know the guys that have come in and delivered inset to us about the ways in which we need to revise, that includes some of this, but it is really useful for us as teachers to give students this message. So they do need to read the work, okay, because they're taking everything in through their visual channels, but then they have to do something with it. They need to reduce it, they need to summarize it, okay, they need to précis it. It's really good for them to highlight keywords by using highlighters, coloured pens, all those kind of things. If we can encourage them to mind map or to draw a diagram, that is useful for some of our dyslexic students. They need to think about mnemonics, rhymes, acronyms, all those kind of things that will allow them to tag information onto something that they are then going to be able to regurgitate and put into their exam. They need to record what they've learnt in notes, revision cards, those kind of things, and write down the main points. But a really important step for them is then to revisit that after a week, to look back over their notes and ask whether there is enough there to enable them to recall everything they need to recall. And actually, if the answer is no, they haven't managed to recall everything, then they must go back to their original notes that they made in lessons, look through their books, and then begin to put more detail into their notes. When they've got notes that are then good enough, of course, they can go on to posters. Posters can be displayed at home, and it's a really good way of making sure that they retain that information. They can then say it, reading out aloud, either to themselves, into a microphone, to somebody else, is a really good way of helping with their memory, because they're taking on the auditory side of things. And then of course they need to check it, so they need to take ownership of that, to check through it, and another good way is to teach somebody else, to buddy up with somebody who is also covering the same material, and then teach it to each other. Okay, so that is the strategy really that as teachers we can be telling students about, particularly as they come towards the examination period. In addition, we can encourage them to write a summary at the end of each topic. It's a really good way of making sure that they have understood the things which are important to each of the topics we cover. And then finally, it's really important that at home, not just at school, they practice exam techniques, and that we check that they are reading accurately the questions and that they're doing the right kind of planning to put their answers together. So often we can assume they've read the question as we would accurately, but then in actual fact they haven't perhaps read it as accurately as they should, or there is a misunderstanding. Okay, so those are things that we can encourage our students, particularly in years 11, to do as we move towards exams. And finally, really, I think it's really important that you accept and that we all understand that actually all dyslexic students are different. You can put things in place for one dyslexic student and they can be going really well. But when you get another one, if you give them the same things, actually it may not go as well. And the reason is because some things work for some dyslexic students and not for others. So it is really important that we try and tailor the provision, the strategies, the things that we do to the student. One of the things that actually really helps us with that is that a lot of our dyslexic type students do know, particularly as they get older in the school, they do know what works for them. They know what a successful learning environment looks like, and they are able to articulate the kinds of things that you can put in place that will help them. And that is really useful as teachers. And I think perhaps the evidence that things are working for some of our dyslexic students is that we now, as a school, have more students than ever before who leave sixth form and then go on either into FE or on to university, which is really encouraging for us. Really important that we do keep calm, and I'm not sure who needs to realise that more, whether it is the student, and I think, yeah, perhaps it is to a great extent, but also that's the parents. Okay, we need to get the message over to parents that actually, although there may be indicators of dyslexia, or in fact a diagnosis, if that's the case, then there are good strategies that we as teachers put in place to help those students make progress. It's also important for students to realise that actually, if I have a learning difficulty such as this, then there is no two ways about it. I have to work harder than anybody else. And that is a message I say to every time I have a consultation with parents over dyslexia. They need to work really hard. And the evidence is that when they do work really hard, when we as teachers put in some of those 4 strategies, when they as students put in that 5th strategy about actively revising, taking ownership of their learning, then they can make good progress. Any questions?
Just when you said about the fact that although it's a disability, there isn't any funding for it in terms of you can't go to the GP and have it. So then lots of parents do seem to be turning to these free online tests. If you have a parent who rings up and says, well, my child's struggling, they've got dyslexia, I've done this test with them, that's what they've got, that doesn't count as a diagnosis, does it? Because it isn't a formal...
No, you are correct. You're absolutely right. I mean, interestingly, we now have at the school, and I think Sarah will confirm this, more students who come with reports that have been privately commissioned by educational psychologists than we ever have before. Okay, now to go to a private educational psychologist will cost between in the region of £400 to £500. That is the expenditure that parents are having to put out. It's a little bit less if you go to somebody that's got that's specially trained in dyslexia but isn't an educational psychologist. So you have these people now who are coming to school with a diagnosis. There are certain caveats, I think, with that, and it is important that you recognise that if people are paying for something, there is also a strong correlation, a strong likelihood that there is something that is going to be found. That's quite. But and it also is interesting because what we are finding now is that different psychologists are using different definitions of dyslexia so that they are finding something that is significant. And it is the only way of getting a diagnosis. We would always recommend that people, if they are worried about something, that they speak to me, they speak to the department, and as teachers, parents' evenings, things like that, you can refer them on to us. We do have students who complete the online one themselves, and then they say, I am a little bit worried. In fact, we had one the other week who's done this, and she came to us, and Sarah's been kind enough to put her on a screener, and actually there is something there that we are concerned about. Equally, there are other times when people have done something online, and then when we've done our assessment, then there hasn't been too much there for us really to think about. But it is interesting that there are increasing numbers of students and parents who are coming to us with this kind of concern. And sometimes it is good for students to get an answer and go to an educational psychologist because that's something they worry about. At other times, if they're going to just use it as an excuse and say, well actually, you know, I have heard this before, I can't do that, I've got dyslexia. Unfortunately, okay, it doesn't work like that. You need to work hard, and there are things here that you can do.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your time,
Thank you
everybody.
Thanks, Dave.
No trouble.